wanted to say hi, I'm Jenny Gates Beckman. I am the Director of Community Engagement and Education at the Jewish Federation of Omaha, and we are so excited to have both familiar faces and perhaps not familiar faces here today. I'm going to let Alan do official introductions for today, but I was going to introduce the topic in general. Really, a lot of folks have been interested in hearing what is up with these elections. They just keep coming more and more often every day. So we have an expert here to help fill us in, and I'm excited that Liz and Alan will be in conversation with Herb Kanan. And I just wanted to also plug his beautiful book because it's adorable, and I love the title. So French Fries and Pizza, some of your more humor-based columns in the Jerusalem Post. And so I'm excited to turn things over to Alan for introductions, but do know that with this format, you're welcome to enter questions in the Q&A function throughout the entire program, and then I'll pop on after some conversation and bring your questions to the forefront. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Alan.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, welcome everybody who's hopping on. This is, as Jenny said, an exciting topic, and as I am a political junkie, whether it's American politics or Israeli politics, elections are always exciting times to learn more about what's going on wherever. And so on Tuesday will be the fourth election in 2 years in Israel. It's kind of a hobby for most Israelis. They just anticipate there'll be elections around the corner, and so they get engaged early on. Today we have a guest, Herb Kanan, who I've known for over 20 years, who just shared with me that he's been at the Jerusalem Post for 36 years, which I didn't think that was possible, but good for you. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're also joined by my friend Liz Feldstern. Liz was the Institute for Holocaust Education Director here for 5 years. And Liz and I have started a dialogue on Sundays, hoping to create a podcast called Israel Rebound. It's kind of how Nebraska and Israel are in conversation and relationship with each other around serious issues. So we are in the pre-production mode of that. We talk and we try to put things together. Hopefully in the near future that will go live, and then you'll get a chance to hear Liz and myself on a regular basis discussing issues around Israel. But for today, we're going to focus solely on the elections that will be on Tuesday. Herb is the political reporter for the Jerusalem Post. Herb and I have gone back many, many years on a variety of issues on Israel. I first met Herb when I had a group of students do a documentary on the University of Illinois alumni who live in Israel. And Herb is a graduate of the University of Illinois. And I'm not sure if you watched the basketball game yesterday, but I believe Illinois won. I don't know if you follow college basketball, but you can comment on that as well. As one of Israel's most famous individuals, Tal Brody is also a graduate of the University of Illinois and a phenomenal individual. So with that, I'm going to kind of let Liz ask the first question to Herb. And as Jenny said, if you have questions you want to pose to us, use the Q&A section of the Zoom to do that. Maybe what I'll do is maybe I'll give each of you 2 minutes to talk a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll go into questions. So Liz, you just want to give a current update on what you're doing in Israel, and then we'll let Herb talk about himself, and then we'll open up for questions.
Sure, yeah. So hi, everybody. It's great to see some familiar names, and I'm thrilled to have a chance to say hi to everybody in Omaha. I am here in Jerusalem, and like other Israelis, ready to be going back to the polls yet again for our fourth time, getting very good at the route. I understand that for a lot of Israelis, their polling place has changed now because of Corona, hoping to spread things out and do a little more social distancing. Mine has not, so I'm going exactly where I've gone the past 3 times. I know right where I'm headed. Excited to have a conversation tonight and hear what other people are thinking ahead of this election, and hear your questions from Omaha, what you want to know more about the election, and what things are going on here in Israel and how it feels. And very glad to have Herb's input, obviously, as an expert and able to let us know what we can expect to see, why it matters, what are the different things that Israelis are thinking about, and what's going on with each of these parties. So just glad to be here.
Herb, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Yeah, my name is Herb Kanan. Been at the Jerusalem Post for 36 years. Been in Israel for 37 years. 4 kids, a couple grandkids. Live outside of Jerusalem, a place called Ma'ale Adumim. And I've been following a lot of elections for a long time, and these are kind of different. And yeah, I'd be interested in relating how in the spirit of the day, right? How are these elections different than all other elections?
Well, I think that might be a good way to start. Since this is the 4th in 2 years, Herb, what makes this election different from all other, since we're on Passover theme, what makes this election different from all other elections? And why is this night different from other nights?
Look, let me just start by just a couple overarching thoughts here. First of all, this is like Alan, like you said, this is our 4th election in 2 years. It's our 12th election since 1996, which means Israel goes to a national election on the average of once every 2 years and 1 month, right? And that's not good. Why is it not good? Why it's not good, number one, because it militates against stability, because it's difficult to plan long-term in ministries if you don't know who the minister is going to be for more than 2 years. And secondly, it's bad because elections, as you know well in America, elections are divisive, right? People don't, and around election time, people don't talk about how great everything is. They talk about how miserable everything is. And the problem is, if you talk about that, 4 times in 2 years, then the population will start to believe it. So it's very divisive, and that's something that, one reason I think that Israel's got to put an end to this now is because we can't have this type of division month after month after month. That being said, I think it's important to understand when you look at the Israeli political scene, to look how fundamentally and dramatically the landscape has shifted over the last 30 years, right? And why 30 years? 30 years goes back to 1992, which was right before the Oslo agreements. I mean, think back to 92, that was Bill Clinton beat George Bush. The same year, Yitzhak Rabin beat Yitzhak Shamir in the elections here. And in that election, you saw something fascinating. The 2 left-wing Zionist, traditional Zionist parties, Meretz and Labor, together, they won 56 seats. 56 seats out of the 120-seat Knesset. That's huge, right? That's huge. Today, or in the last elections, last March, those same 2 parties won 6 seats combined. They ran together. And the polls aren't showing them doing a lot better this time as well. So you have to ask, that's a fundamental political realignment in this country. And you have to ask yourself, what happened? What happened? Why did the Zionist left lose 90% of its strength over the last 30 years? And I think there's basically 3 reasons for that. Number 1 has to do with demographics. Number 2 has to do with the Second Intifada. And number 3, the Second Intifada, that period of intense terrorism from 2000 to 2005, which fundamentally changed Israel. And the third has to do with the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Let me just briefly touch just a minute on each of those. Demographically, this country has gone through the same type of change, is even more dramatic than you've had in the States, and that's had an influence on our politics. In 1990, this was a country of 4.3 million people, right? In 2000, the population rose by some 40%, and it was like 6 million people. Today, Israel's population stands at 9.1 million people. That's a huge demographic change. That's an explosion. Much of that caused by the Russian immigration, right, in the 1990s. Russian immigrations came in huge numbers. They're not voting for the left. The religious population, the Haredi population, their numbers are outstripping the non-religious, non-Haredi population of the country as well, and they're not voting for the left. So there's demographic shifts in this country, which is kind of skewing it to the right. The second thing is the Second Intifada. Second Intifada changed everything. I mean, 5 years of mind-numbing terrorism, everybody felt it, even people who believed that, believed in two-state solution, believed that if you give back territory, you're going to get peace. They were kind of disabused of that notion during this period. And then the final straw, the final straw there was the withdrawal from Gaza, the hope that if you do what the world wanted you to do, you remove the settlements from Gaza, you're going to get a good situation, you're going to get quiet. That, as everybody knows, didn't exactly go as we thought. So even those people who today are still, advocates of a two-state solution, they look at the situation on the ground and they see that it's not realistic. So what's happened is the left, the traditional left-right lines in Israeli politics, meaning left, meaning in favor of concessions to the Palestinians, right, meaning in favor of settlements, those have been blurred. Those are no longer the main issues right now. Those are no longer the fault line. There's a new fault line in this country, and the fault line has a name, and it's a simple name, and the name is Bibi Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the fault line. And the last elections, this will be the fourth election this cycle, going back to April 2019. Each election has been about Netanyahu, right? Is he a saint or is he a scoundrel? Is he a guy who we should want to keep in power, or is he somebody who needs to go at all costs? And Netanyahu has divided the country into two. And what you found fascinating, you're talking about why is this election different than the other three elections? In the other three elections, essentially, you had the center and left-wing parties saying, let's get rid of Netanyahu and the right. This time, you have the opposition parties saying, let's get rid of Netanyahu by the right, meaning some of the right-wing parties to the right of Netanyahu, are actually saying what the left has been saying up until now, and that is he can't run the country because he's on trial, and because his vision is clouded. He's going to do what will need to be done to keep him out of the courtroom, rather what's good for the country. If in the past three elections that has been said by the left, this time you have parties on the right saying that as well. So when you think of Israeli politics right now, it's a completely different beast, right? When they talk on the news about who's going to win, it used to be the left-wing bloc or the right-wing bloc. That's not the definition anymore. It's the anti-Bibi bloc or the pro-Bibi bloc. And what's different this time is that within the anti-Bibi bloc, you have parties who are more to the right of Netanyahu than Netanyahu. Speaking about Avigdor Lieberman, Gideon Sa'ar, these are right-wing guys, but they're in the anti-Bibi bloc. So the whole traditional way we looked at Israeli politics has changed, and it's changed fundamentally. Let me just say one other thing, and then we'll go to discussion.
Hold on a second. We've got somebody who's on a phone that isn't muted. So somebody who's on a phone, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you. Herb, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Look, the election right now, according to the polls, Israel stops taking polls, I think 72 hours beforehand. So the last polls were on Friday. It's too close to call. It's really too close to call. But between the anti-Bibi forces and the pro-Bibi forces, it could go either way. There are three things happening in this election that we didn't see in the past that I think might make it a little bit more difficult for Netanyahu, or that makes it more challenging for him. Although the momentum in the polls is on his favor right now. The three things. The first thing is what I said, that the voice is saying that he can't be prime minister anymore, also coming from the right, not only the left. That's new. The second thing in this election is there's no Donald Trump, right? In the past three elections, Trump was a huge asset, a huge political asset for Netanyahu in two instances. First, Netanyahu was able to say, hey, I got a tremendous relationship with the president of the United States. That's good for Israel. And on the other hand, Trump gave him gifts before the last three elections, or before two of the last three elections, right? Before the first election in April of 2019, Trump recognized Israel's sovereignty of the Golan Heights. That happened just 2 weeks before the election. That wasn't a coincidence. In the last election, Trump dropped the deal of the century, the best plan that Israel's ever had by an American administration. That happened 2 weeks before the election as well. So those were boosts for Netanyahu. He doesn't have it this time, right? He has a Democratic president. He has Joe Biden. Biden made a point of not calling him immediately, right? We fretted over here because it took them a month to call Netanyahu. We're saying, don't they love us anymore? The relationship is, is going out the window again. I think what Biden was trying to do was kind of stay out of the election. He didn't want to give Netanyahu anything that Netanyahu could then use in his campaign, right? If he had called Netanyahu in the first week or made him one of his first calls, and Netanyahu would have said, hey, look, I had a good relationship with Trump. I got a good relationship with Joe Biden, who I've known for 40 years. Biden didn't want to give him that. But Netanyahu, because he's such a consummate campaigner, and he is the best campaigner out there, right? Just as an aside, Netanyahu has been prime minister of this country. Last Shabbat marked 15 years that he's been the prime minister over 2 terms. 15 years. That's a big chunk of time for a country that's only 73 years old. It's actually 20% of the country's entire history. He's been the prime minister. And why has he been able to stay for so long? Because he's a great campaigner. So he took this non-call from Biden and he turned it into an asset. He was asked about it in an interview. The interviewer said, aren't you worried the message this sends? And he said, well, we want somebody who can stand up to the US president. So he was able to turn it around a bit. Biden eventually called him, now everything's back to was, but he doesn't have Trump in the White House as an asset like he did in the previous 3 elections. And the final big difference this time, and this is the major difference, is the corona. The corona has shook everything up. The corona has taken all other issues pretty much off the table. Netanyahu, we just signed the Abraham Accords, right? The Abraham Accords, agreements with 4 Arab countries, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco. That's a big deal. It's not an issue in the campaign. Palestinians, not an issue in the campaign. None of this is an issue in the campaign. The only thing that's an issue is corona, right? Has Netanyahu done well in dealing with the corona, which his supporters will say, right? That he's Mr. Vaccine. He brought this country the vaccines, and because of the vaccines, we're now coming out of the lockdowns while some countries are just going into them for the 3rd time. Or because 6,000 Israelis have died during this thing, was he an abysmal failure, which is what the opposition is trying to say. So the corona has dominated this election in a way that no other issue is dominant, no other non-military diplomatic or security issue has ever dominated an Israeli election. And that's different. Because if in America the elections are about the economy, stupid, right? Here they never are. Here they're always about the Palestinians or the Iranians or the borders or whatever. This is one of the first time that you have social issues, health issues, economic issues dominating the campaign. And that's a little bit different this time than what we've seen in the past. So let me stop there, and we can take it forward as you see fit.
Thanks, Herb. Liz, you have a comment or questions?
Yeah, for sure. You said so many interesting things, and I have a long list of questions, but maybe I'll start with just 2. And you can answer either or in whatever order makes sense for you. So in terms of you described that at this point in time, there are anti-Bibi sentiments coming from both his right and his left. And I'm just curious whether with those parties being, other than the fact that they all don't like Bibi, very different in their points of view, is there a universe in which they decide to come together and sit in a coalition together after the election? That's one question. And my other question is sort of a larger, maybe more theoretical question. I think the things that you described in terms of why the left has sort of disappeared in Israel because of demographic changes and intifada and things like that are all very well taken, of course. But since none of those are brand new changes, one might think that, as is usually the case in democracies, just as the pendulum has swung to the right, it's bound to swing back to the left, but that hasn't happened. And it doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon. And so I'm wondering whether there are other reasons, right, that you could point to that for that lack of a coming back of the left. Is it because you know, something about the way politics in Israel work in general? Does it have to do with the difficulty of getting recognition of a new name because of our election laws, and right, that you can't have a lot of television and radio ads and things like that? Just whether there's something that you think could explain why it hasn't come back, even though those changes, it's already a little ways back.
Interesting questions. Look, I mean, let me start from the second one because that's the one I remember. I think one of the problems of the left is, and one of the reasons it hasn't come back and the pendulum hasn't swung back, is because their message doesn't resonate. It simply doesn't resonate. The idea, the main message of the left for so long has been just kind of focusing on the Palestinian issue, and this idea that if Israel would just make more concessions, there would be peace. And that message doesn't resonate with the public that seeing what has happened, right? That saw that Israel was willing to give at Camp David in 2000, that Ehud Barak, who was the last left-wing prime minister the country ever had, and that was in 1999, that he was willing to give Arafat 95% of the territory and split Jerusalem, and it wasn't enough for Arafat, and that instead of accepting that, he started a terrorist war against Israel, right? I think the Israelis were mugged by reality, and that message that, well, if we just try it again, different, or a little bit different, or harder, it'll work this time. I don't think it resonates with the Israeli public, who again, I can't overstate the degree in which the 5 years of the Intifada was a psychological trauma for everybody, because everybody felt it. And people aren't stupid, right? And if you're willing to give things back, then it didn't work. You're willing to give back Gaza, that didn't work. Why do you think if you try the same thing again with the same actors? Because the actors haven't changed on the other side, right? You still have Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president of the Palestinian Authority. He's been there since 2004. That hasn't changed. Why do you think in the world it will change this time? It'll be different. That the left hasn't come up with a cogent or a convincing argument for the Israeli public why it would work this time. So I think that's the main reason. As long as the demographics, I think demographics is important. Look, and I think it's interesting here because we're speaking to an American audience, whereas you can maybe look at the American polity and think that what the American polity is because of demographics is shifting left. In Israel, it's shifting right. And what does that mean for future Israel-American relations? That's also an interesting topic. As far as your first question and the glue that will keep all these different parts in the anti-Bibi coalition together, and that's also a kind of an imponderable. Nobody knows, because mathematically, in order to reach 61, the anti-Bibi coalition is going to have to coalesce the Meretz party on the far left, right, with Avigdor Lieberman and maybe Naftali Bennett on the right, and they look at the universe through different colored glasses, right? They look at that, how to approach the Palestinian issue completely differently. Now, what they're saying is, or what some of these potential partners are saying is, well, what's important now is just to move Netanyahu aside. That's what's crucial for Israel's future. Once we move Netanyahu aside, then we'll deal with all these other issues in the next election, but not in this election. This election is their argument is he's a danger to Israeli democracy. He has to be moved out. And in order to move him out, we will join hands. The question I ask is whether a distaste for Netanyahu is going to be strong enough cement for these guys to actually cooperate and put together a coalition. And I'm not sure.
So Herb, good response to Liz's question. The last election, the Arab Party, the Joint List, they had a significant number of seats, and they were pretty much the fourth largest component to that election. Do you still see the Arab vote being as significant this time as last time?
Look, and that's a tremendous question, because it's a tremendous issue. Watching the Arab vote this time is fascinating. It's fascinating. because what you saw, you're right. In the last election, the United Arab List got 15 seats. Right? 15 seats. It's huge, and that's a lot of seats. And what the Israeli public doesn't realize is, we kind of look at the Arabs and say, well, the Arab List, they all think alike. They're not, right? You have very right-wing religious component of that party, and you have a left-wing, very nationalist, pro-Palestinian component of the party. They all got together into one party, but that party hasn't held together for this election. The right-wing religious component of that party has formed its own party. So the Arab List, the United Arab List, is not what it was last time. The list is polling a lot worse than it did last time. Last time it got 15 seats. Now the United Arab List is polling at 8, and this other list that broke off, Ra'am, is getting 4 seats. Now, but what's even more fascinating about watching the Arab vote this time is that they're talking about the Likud picking up between 2 to 3 seats on the Arab street. Now let that sink in for a minute. The Likud, Bibi Netanyahu, could get, and he's running, and he's got campaign billboards in Arabic this time. He's going after between 2 to 3 seats in the Arab street that could change the whole complexion of the government. And why did that happen? What's happening here? And I think that's fascinating to watch, because I think here you see that the Abraham Accords, remember I said that the Abraham Accords hasn't had a big impact on the elections. I think on the Arab street, it has had an impact, and it's an impact in 2 different ways. The first is the Arabs have always said that they can't deal with a right-wing government, right? They can't deal with a right-wing government because of the Palestinian issue. This gentleman who broke away, Mansour Abbas, the right-wing religious guy, he says, we want to deal with any government because when you deal with the government, you get things for your community. The Arab street's position up until now has been, nope, we can't deal with the right-wing government. We want, we're not going to deal with them. What happens? Along comes the crown prince of the United Arab Emirates, right? And he says, I'm willing to deal with the right-wing government because it's good for me. It's good for my country. The Emir of Bahrain says the same thing. So the Arab street says, look, if they can deal with Netanyahu and get things that are good for them, why can't I deal with Netanyahu and get things that are good for me? So that's a whole different way of looking at things, and that's why Netanyahu is again, he's polling 2 to 3 seats among the Arabs. There was something else here that happened. The Abraham Accords went to the vote in the Knesset in September, and the accord with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain came to a vote, and the United Arab Party, the Joint Arab List, which which represents the Arabs, they voted against it. They voted against it, even though the polls showed that 65% of the Israeli Arab public favored those accords. Why did they favor those accords? They favor those accords because it's good for them, because they'll now be able to travel freely to the Gulf states. Because if the United Arab Emirates pumps $10 billion into the Israeli economy, as they say they're going to do, and sets up firms and companies here, and Israelis go over there and sets up shop over there, who's the natural middleman who's going to benefit from this, right? It's the Israeli Arab street. So I think there was a lot of disillusionment among the Israeli Arabs that the party that they sent to the Knesset with a historic vote last time of 15 seats just didn't deliver for them. And they want their needs to be taken care of, not only for the Arab list to worry about the Palestinians. Why did the Arab list vote against the Abraham Accords? Because the Palestinian Authority was opposed to it, right? But now you have people on the Arab street saying, it's not good for us. I have to worry about my dinner plate. And if they can do it in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, I can do it here as well without being a traitor to the greater Palestinian Arab cause.
Liz, any follow-up with that question?
I think it's a really well taken point. I think also it's important to realize that 15 seats, while it's a lot in comparison to what Arab parties have held in the past, if we think about demographics, though, that's at least as it should be, right? The Arab population in Israel is huge and the fastest growing population. I think 1 in 4 school-age children growing up in Israel right now is an Arab. And so I think that's another point that that is good for us to keep in mind in terms of the demographics and, you know, to what extent the Knesset represents Israel as a whole and whose voice is being heard and whose voice isn't. And that attempt by the Arab population to speak in a united voice isn't working, and that now it will be more divided. We'll see what that means, and, you know, and who it helps and who it doesn't.
Okay. So just to remind people who are following along on the webinar that if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them in about 10-15 minutes. I have a question. You kind of talked about President Biden and his pause in contacting Netanyahu after President Biden became president. Do you see a challenge between the potential new government in Israel and the relationship with the United States and other countries in the diaspora?
Look, I mean, I think it's, everybody realizes that, you know, that the type of relationship that Netanyahu had with President Trump is not the type of relationship that Netanyahu is going to have with President Biden. We don't see eye to eye on certain key issues that we saw eye to eye on with Trump, namely Iran and the Palestinians, which are, you know, two pretty big issues. However, you know, there was a lot of concern. Like, as Israelis, as Jews, we fret, right? We fret, therefore we are. And that's why this whole lack of the non-call was such a huge story in Israel for so long, because you're worried, oh my God, what does this mean? The relationship is going down the tubes again, right? And I think we have to put things in proportion. The first couple months of the Biden administration have been okay. There were a couple of appointments that Israel wasn't crazy about, Rob Malley being the main one. But if you look at what the administration has done, right, there's not much that we can complain about. They're not rushing back into the Iranian agreement right now. They are discussing it very closely with Israel right now. They're not coming out. You know, Barack Obama, when he was sworn into office in 2009, the next day, he appointed George Mitchell as his special Mideast envoy because he was swinging for the fences. He wanted to bring peace to the Middle East. Biden has taken a much more sober approach to that, realizing that we're not going there. It just doesn't exist anymore. You can't swing for the fences. It's not going to work. There was a lot of concern here, obviously, about, you know, to what degree were the progressives going to be dictating Biden's foreign policy. And I think one of the things that the Secretary of State said a couple of weeks ago was that the administration was going to adopt the International Holocaust Committee definition of anti-Semitism, right, which says that certain forms of anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism, that was opposed by the progressives in the state. Blinken said, this is our policy, this is administration policy. So I think that put to rest some of those concerns as well, as if the progressives were going to drive, or Bernie Sanders was going to drive the policy towards Israel. So I think that's kind of, you know, people are less concerned now than maybe they were a few months ago. That being said, again, we're two different countries. We have different interests. We see things differently. There are going to be differences and there's going to be disagreements. The question is how you deal with those disagreements. And I think that's going to be interesting because when Obama came into power, he actually wanted to underline the daylight. He even said it, you know, there's no problem showing daylight between the U.S. and Israel. I don't think Biden is coming from that school of thought. I think he realizes that doesn't do anybody any favors. It's better to deal with the disagreements quietly. So I think, again, right now, I think things are off on a pretty good foot.
Great. Liz, you have a question? If not, I have a question for you. So do you have a comment?
Go for it.
So this is going to be your fourth time voting in Israel. You said you know where well,
my fourth time in 2 years. I did vote in Israel before these 4 elections.
Okay. So how do you feel like you're being informed of the platform issues as well as the candidates? So in America, you've got this barrage of information. How are you evaluating the way to vote?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I'll say, from the perspective of someone who grew up in the United States and, spent time in Omaha specifically and back here in Israel, the feel of a lead up to an election is a very, very different. The laws in Israel surrounding campaigns are different. And so we don't have the barrage of television ads that you have in the United States, because it's highly regulated and mostly not allowed. We do have billboards and internet advertisement, because it is not yet as regulated in Israel. So there's more of that. But just, to make the point that it feels very different. So then you're left with the question, well, how are you getting your information? And to a certain extent, it leaves that onus, that responsibility, I think, to a greater extent on the individual citizen, right? You have to want to go out there and get the information to understand what each party is about and what their platform is. Right now, they don't even all have a platform. But I did come across something that I thought was really interesting. One of the larger Israeli media outlets called Mako came out with an election compass. I think it only exists in Hebrew, but you can answer a series of questions where you stand on various issues and, how you rank those issues in order of importance to you. And it will tell you which parties you're aligned with and by what percent. So I don't know how many Israelis are using that, but I certainly checked it out just to see what it would say about where I fall. I think that, what Herb said before in terms of that you can't underestimate how much this election is, people's gut feelings on whether Bibi is a saint or a criminal, whether you think he should be the one leading the country or not. I think that is the main thing that people are going to walk into the polls with on Tuesday. Whether that's the best way to pick a leader for this country, I can't say, but I think that's how most people will vote.
So I think that's a really interesting perspective. So you, again, the process in Israel is a little bit different, where there's really very little communicating 72 hours before the election, so polling stops.
Right.
But people feel very much engaged. Herb, welcome back. I think we lost you for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. I asked Liz while you were gone, what's her personal experience with the election process, and how has media and information been communicated out to the general populace? And she was talking about the Machot compass. I don't know, is that what you called it? Mako compass.
Right.
But in your 36 years of experience, how have you seen the evolution of how marketing towards the elections has taken place? And there's a caveat to that, and that's, I know that over the past several elections, American strategists have been implemental in some of the candidates' marketing. Can you talk to those two pieces?
Look, I mean, it's changed dramatically in the time that I've been here, basically because of social media. Social media has changed everything. The prime minister does it. They don't need the press to the same degree as they did in the past. They can just go over the heads of the press and go right to Facebook, which everybody's doing, going to Facebook and Twitter. So the social media has changed how they reach the voters, and that drives the different campaign messages. This time also because of Corona. I mean, Corona, it was kind of like the situation in the U.S. with Trump as well. Trump was great at rallies. Bibi was great at rallies. Up until a week ago, he wasn't able to hold rallies, so that kind of impinged on his ability to campaign. So it was all done through social media. And also you go through social media, that opens up, the Pandora's box of fake news, what's real, what's not real, the same type of problems you have in the US, we also have here as well. But the way the campaigns have evolved over the years, has changed dramatically as a result of the social media. One thing that I noticed in this campaign is kind of counterintuitive. Well, I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but I found it very interesting. And that's that this campaign, in my estimation, hasn't been as divisive or as negative, hasn't been as negative as the previous campaigns. In fact, Netanyahu, one of his campaign slogans was, we can beat this thing if we're united. That sounds more like a pitch for the Federation in Omaha rather than it does for a political party in Israel. That idea of unity, and why did the Likud strategists come out with that? Because I think the feeling was pretty much that people are just sick of the negativity. They don't want to hear it anymore. It's not going to make a difference, and it's better to put out a more positive message than we have in the past. Now, I don't want to overstate that and say that this has been a love fest, because it hasn't. But the same viciousness that we've seen in the past 3 elections hasn't been demonstrated to the same extent this time, for the most part, right? There have been exceptions. One of those exceptions has been Avigdor Lieberman from the Israel Beitenu party, the party that kind of targets Russian-speaking immigrants. He's gone all out against the Haredim, against the ultra-Orthodox, and he's that anti-Haredi message is kind of landing on fertile soil these days, because during the whole corona crisis, we saw that the pockets of the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community were flouting the corona regulations. They weren't going along with it. They were sending their kids to schools, yeshiva. So there is a lot of anti-Haredi sentiment, which he is playing on. But what's interesting is he's really the only one who's doing that. And why? Because Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid also has run in the past on kind of an anti-Haredi position, meaning that the Haredi ultra-Orthodox should not dominate religious life in Israel. But he's being careful not to go overboard in his attack, because he's thinking about the day after. And then he might actually need the Haredi parties in his coalition, so he doesn't want to alienate them. Avigdor Lieberman is just, he doesn't care. He's just alienating them because he realizes he's not going to be able to sit with them in a coalition.
Good. So before we open it up to questions from the greater pool, I'm going to ask one other question of both of you. And that has to be, is there an environmental party that has gained prominence with the oil spill along the coastline?
That's an interesting question, and one would think in a normal country that would be a huge issue. Alan, this is the first I've heard of it in your question in the election, right? And nobody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about it. It's all Bibi and it's all Corona.
I'm sorry to hear that. So the reason I say that is our partnership region is the Western Galilee. And on a call the other day with them, that was a major concern, because they're seeing the tar kind of, build up along the coastline of northern Israel, and it's become a problem for the communities. So as a local issue, I would think it'd be a serious issue, but on a national level, you're saying it's not an issue at all. So.
And I would put that in a category. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. It hasn't played a part in the campaign. In general, that climate, climate warming, those types of issues, they don't penetrate here, because the feeling here is that there's other more important existential issues that affect us on an existential level in Israel, so we don't really have to worry about those issues. You can argue whether or not that's right or wrong, but I think that's how people look at those issues, and they don't. There is no environmental party here to speak of, and the environmental plank isn't the big plank in any of the parties, except to a certain extent in the Meretz party. But even there, it's not the main issue.
Liz, you were going to comment?
Just to say that I would put that, environmentalism in the same category with a couple of other issues that are, seen as very important and on the main agenda in other countries, including the United States, and here aren't getting any play at all, right? Religious pluralism, which for Jews outside of Israel seems like it should be at the forefront of discussion in Israel, is barely, something that has come up in any of these recent elections. And, just for better or worse, that's
So
That's the
that
situation.
leads into another question that I have that I'll hold on to see if anybody else in the audience asks it, because I'm sure it's on the forefront of others. Jenny, I'm going to invite you back to facilitate the questions. So if you're following along, why don't you put your video back on, and if you have questions, kind of read them out to Liz and to Herb.
Well, we do have one from Marty. He asks, it seems to me that the Israeli left really doesn't have a domestic program or any policy program other than the Palestinian issue. There certainly are issues and initiatives in Israel. Why do these parties seem so limited about charting a future for the country?
That's a good question. I think that's, that goes to what Liz said earlier. Why hasn't the left gained traction? I think that if the left would put some of these social issues higher up on their agenda, then they might be able to gain more votes. Labor, actually, they've got a leader, Merav Michaeli, who's the only woman leading a major party here now. She's actually talking more about social issues than the Palestinians, and I think she realizes that that's something that could possibly resonate with voters more than the Palestinian issue. Look, there's definitely a room there, right? I mean, there are a lot of social issues that need to be addressed, and I think there are a lot of labor, if they would go in that direction, could actually make more inroads rather than beating the Palestinian issue. Just keep beating that horse, and it's not bringing them any benefits at the ballot box.
I think Merav Michaeli is an interesting person. She's basically holding the left together, or the Labor Party together, by threads, and I give her credit for being able to do that. Although for being one of the largest parties in the past, to be down to 3 or 4 seats is quite shocking to see. But she seems to have a firm grip on the success of labor. Jenny, other questions?
We have another question, but not typed in. So we don't have any current that I am able to discern.
Okay, so maybe somebody will continue to ask. So we have 10 minutes left. So this question kind of goes a little bit to what Liz was talking in the pluralism. And so this is for either one of you or both of you to want to weigh into. A couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Court ruled on the conversion question of whether or not the reform and conservative conversions in Israel could be recognized. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of that. It created quite a stir for a couple of days. I don't know if that's played out at all in the current state of the elections.
So maybe I'll chime in and then let Herb say all the things that I didn't say, because he'll know much more than I do. But I am from what I've understood, the only extent to which this issue has played out and really come up in these elections is part of the larger question having to do with whether or not there is a need for judiciary reform in Israel. And when people talk about that, it's sort of a code word for, is the Supreme Court too activist and too liberal? And there are people in this campaign who have been talking about that issue, not as much as they've been talking about how much they hate Bibi or think he's great, and not as much as they've been talking about Corona. But there is a lot of conversation around this issue of whether there is a need for some sort of overhaul and reform of the judiciary. Herb, is that fair to say, do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the judiciary stepped into this issue because the Knesset over the last 15 years was unable to make a decision. And the reason the Knesset couldn't make a decision is because the Haredi parties were not going to allow reform and conservative conversions to be allowed in Israel. I just want to kind of a technical point, but I think it's important because this isn't a question. What did the Supreme Court do? The Supreme Court said that in the past, right, if you were a conservative reform or if you wanted to be converted in Omaha by a conservative or reform rabbinical court, you could do so, and you could come to Israel and become a citizen and be accepted as a Jew. And what the Supreme Court did is they said, well, there used to be a kind of a weird situation where you could do that abroad, but you couldn't do it in Israel. Now we, the Supreme Court, are saying that for civil reasons, right, for reasons of citizenship, we're saying that reform and conservative conversions will be accepted in Israel. What does that mean for citizenship? According to the law of return, any Jew is eligible to immigrate to Israel. Or not only any Jew, but anybody who even has one Jewish grandparent can immigrate to Israel. So the Supreme Court is saying that if you go through this process in Israel, you can get Israeli citizenship. However, that doesn't make you a Jew according to the religious laws or the standard in Israel, meaning that you still can't get married or divorced or buried in religious ceremonies. That hasn't changed. All that's changed is that it's for reasons of citizenship, you're now recognized as a Jew. Why is it important? Because this is the first time, however, that the Supreme Court has in any way officially recognized reform and conservative movements in Israel. So in that degree, it was big. It's not having any impact on the elections, on the run-up to the elections, the campaign. It could, however, have a huge impact after the elections when they start to build the coalitions. Because believe me, if Netanyahu wants to get the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi parties into the coalition, one of their first demands will be to roll that back, to legislate in the Knesset laws that say, no, we're overriding the Supreme Court. That will be now their number one issue. So although this issue isn't important now before the elections, after the elections, it will be in the coalition building, not only for Netanyahu, by the way. If Gideon Sa'ar or Naftali Bennett or even Yair Lapid want to try to form a coalition, they're probably going to have to get one of the two ultra-Orthodox parties into their coalition, and they will face that same demand. So the issue is important for after the elections much more than before.
Jenny, other questions?
Yeah, we have a couple more that came through. I'm going to go through several just so that you have plenty to think about and then you can answer them. So one was a question of clarity saying, you spoke about the issue being the virus, that Corona is the issue. Can you tease out and better define what that means to you? Also, how do you see the Israeli polity interacting with the American Jewish community? Not the American government, but the American Jewish community. We have an individual who wants to hear more about your book. And I know you have two. I only showed one of them, but and then I have a longer one that I'll ask once you're done with these.
Okay, as far as fleshing out the whole issue of the virus, what does it mean? How is the virus an issue? It's an issue because the question is, how did Netanyahu manage the virus? Did he do it well? Were his decisions made because of political considerations? I'll give you an example, right? Everybody, you've read about how, again, like I said earlier, in the ultra-Orthodox community, they flouted the regulations, they flouted the lockdown, they sent their kids to school, and there wasn't really any enforcement. And why wasn't there enforcement? There are those who will say that Bibi didn't want to enforce it because he needs those parties in his coalition after the elections, and he didn't want to do anything to antagonize them. So were his decisions made because of real, true interest, or were his decisions made because of his own political interests? That's one way. The second big issue is the vaccines, right? The vaccines. Is he responsible for getting the vaccines? Should he be given all the credit for getting the vaccines? I mean, he's taking the credit on himself. He's even saying that because of my standing in the world, I was able to call the head of Pfizer 30 times, including at 3 in the morning. At 3 a.m., right? And nobody else would be able to do that. Yair Lapid couldn't do that. So that's how it's kind of playing into the elections. Was his managing of the crisis, was it a success was it as a failure? Should he be blamed for 6,000 Israelis dying from the thing? Or would that have happened no matter who was in power, because that was just the nature of the pandemic? So that's about the virus.
I'm going to see if Liz, as a citizen, wants to respond to the question about the virus. As somebody who's been, impacted by the lockdown and by having to work remotely and kids not being in school, how do you see the government's role and Netanyahu's role in the virus in addressing it?
Look, I mean, there are, I think it's a mixed bag, right? There were things that Israel did so well in handling the pandemic, and the fact that Israel has a lot of experience with emergency situations, with rolling out major public health campaigns showed, right? This was not Israel's first rodeo in several senses. On the other hand, there were a lot of times along the way when it did not seem like the experts were talking to each other in an effective way. There were times when all of the medical experts were saying one thing and policies were being put in place that didn't take those into account, or didn't fully take them into account. And when the government said, if our numbers get to X, if our numbers get to 2,000, we're going to close. But then they didn't close. And the question is, what changed? To what extent were they making decisions based on political things or economic, considerations, and not just health ones? So I think it felt very mixed. Maybe it's just my personality. I find it very hard to give too much blame or credit to any one individual, right? Things that worked well because Israel has an amazing public health system that existed way before Bibi was in power. And the things that didn't work well have to do with the complications of having a lot of voices, a totally unprecedented situation, and there's no way that it's going to work perfectly. So personally, I don't think it's a good measure, right, to put all the blame or the credit on one person, but it seems to be that that's how a lot of people want to view this situation and vote. I wish there were more issues on the table. I wish people were talking about social issues, but that's not where the narrative is.
Okay, thank you. Next question on the polity between the elections and American Jewish community. Was that it, Jenny? Was that the question?
I mean, there was one other question, but I do want to be mindful of time as we're very close to 3. I'll run through the last question as well, because it does relate to something that Liz just said.
Before you do that, Liz and Herb, would you mind staying on for another 5 or 10 minutes, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great.
So there's obviously a huge gap in attitudes between Israel and a majority of American Jews relative to Trump in particular and the extreme right in general. It appears that Israel's perspective is very transactional. Is there some realization in Israel about the existential threats to democracy and the issues of racism and also anti-Semitism that we're feeling here in the States?
Look, that's an important question. I think it goes to the heart of the matter, and that is, I just want to state something that's obvious, but it's not. And that's, we're one people, right? The Jews are one people, but we live in completely different realities, right? We live in different realities, and our interests are, we have different interests. When you take Trump as an example, when the Americans look at Trump, they look at all the nutty stuff about Trump. They look at Stormy Daniels, and they look at the racism, and they look at the whole bag. They look at Trump the man. When Israelis look at Trump, for the most part, they're not looking at that. They're looking at Trump through one prism. And is he good for us? Right? And that's why on Trump, you had a situation where most Israelis, if they were Americans, would have voted for Trump, whereas most American Jews, obviously voted against Trump. And that's because, we're sitting in different places our interests are different, our threat levels are different, and what's important to us are different. Right? When the American Jew goes to vote for a U.S. president, Israel is not number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even 6 on the list. When Israelis look at an American president, Israel is the only thing on the list. And I think there is kind of a disconnect between an inability of Israeli Jews to understand where Americans are coming from, right? We don't understand the dog whistles that you hear. We don't understand the concerns that you feel when you have this racism in America because we don't live it. And by the same token, you don't necessarily understand what we're going through here as well. A lot of Americans would like, Israel to be more forthcoming in concessions to Palestinians, but they're not facing the terrorism. Or, the whole debate over Iran. Israelis, for the most part, thought that Iranian deal was not good, and it was an existential threat for us. The American Jews didn't want to get into a big argument with the U.S. president administration. So we see things differently because of where we sit. And I think that's just a reality that we have to learn to live with. We're not gonna see things. We're not gonna see things through the same lenses. What we can try to do is understand better the other side, but realize that there's limitations to being able to feel what the other guy is feeling where he sits, because you're not feeling the same things where you sit.
Any other questions, Jenny? Or is that pretty much it? So I'm going to ask one final question, and I'll give both Herb and Liz a few minutes to close out your thoughts. There was a proposal before the Knesset to allow more direct influence by the American Jewish leadership on policies in Israel. It was kind of put together, I think, by a member of Knesset, Michal Kavler-Wunsch, and 2 other members of Knesset. I don't know, I know that it didn't go very well, but where did that come from? Why is it that some members of Knesset think that the American Jewish world should have some influence in the workings of the Knesset?
Liz, you want to start, or?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think so a little bit it speaks to something that Herb said earlier about the fact that we do want to be able to think of ourselves as one people, and that while Americans may sometimes feel like it's not their place to intervene in Israeli politics, right? That they don't send their children to fight in our army, so why should they have a voice? There is an argument that as people who send their support to Israel in other ways and are part of this global, people, that those voices are important. And in particular, I think that call to have Americans make their voice more heard in Israel is coming from liberal points of view who say that on the other end of the political spectrum, Americans are not afraid and have not been afraid to throw their weight around in Israel. And so it's not a fair fight if liberal Americans, progressive Americans are not also given an opportunity and willing to speak up for the kind of Israel they would like to see, even though they are not Israeli citizens and they don't have a formal opportunity to vote here. I think that's part of the conversation.
Look, I'm gonna be honest, direct and honest, and that is when it comes to issues of security and issues of borders. Very few Israelis are gonna agree to the proposition that people who don't live here should have a say. I mean, how can somebody who lives, abroad make decisions that are going to send my son into Lebanon to fight? It's a non-starter. Where you could have a conversation, however, is over questions like we saw the Supreme Court talk about, like issues about, pluralism in Israel, because that affects the American Jews when they come here. I think you will have a much more willingness from Israelis to accept the idea that on those issues, on issues of religious issues, of pluralism issues, then there's a legitimacy for American Jews or Jews in diaspora to want a voice. But when it comes to issues about security, where they're not being asked to pay the price, they're not necessarily going to be given an opportunity to set policy, which is why that idea or that proposition that the Knesset member made was pretty much dead on arrival.
Okay. You guys want to do final thoughts on the election, on life in Israel? I'll give you each 2 minutes to kind of conclude out how you feel about moving forward on Tuesday.
Life in Israel would take a lot more than 2 minutes, but on the election specifically, I personally, and I'm not sure that I've heard anybody else in Israel say it either, don't see any reason to think that this election is going to lead to results different than the previous 3. And so, you know, it'll just be number 4 out of who knows how many. I don't think anything too conclusive is going to happen on Tuesday.
Look, I mean, I agree. I agree with Liz. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I think certain people are fed up with this constant election cycle and might be willing to make compromises to join a coalition this time in order to put it to an end. But I'm not convinced. But I wanted to leave, though, not necessarily on just a negative note, because despite all that, right, despite our very fractured political moment, and despite the coronavirus, which has upended everything all over the world, including in Israel, our situation right now is pretty good. It's pretty strong. Diplomatically, we just signed accords with 4 major Arab states. Saudi Arabia wants to come to greater accommodations with us. Diplomatically, our standing in the world is good. It's strong. Terrorism is at the lowest level it's been since 1962. Militarily, we're not really challenged by any other army in the region, right? So our strategic situation overall is good. And I think that's also something we should keep in mind when we dig down into the weeds and look at the politics, and because you can get lost in the weeds. It's tough. It's tough here, but it's tough all over right now. And we're not doing that bad when you take everything into consideration. I think that's important to keep in mind, even if this next election doesn't give us as conclusive a result as we would like. We'll figure it out eventually. It might take some time, but eventually we'll figure it out.
Thank you. So before I turn it over to Jenny to close us out, so the election's on Tuesday. Whoever has the majority seats has 3 weeks to form a government.
45 days, right?
45 days. And then, so it'll be a while before we know if there is a new government. And if not, there'll be a 5th election in June. Is that the plan?
Look, this thing could schlep out for a long time, and it could schlep out for a long time for another reason. And this time you have more people voting. There's no absentee voting here, but people are not voting at their ballot box. They're voting somewhere else. You have 600,000 this time, where in the past you only had 300,000. Because of the coronavirus, they can't go to the regular polling place. It's going to take longer for the ballots to be counted. Then we go into Pesach. Right. So the whole coalition wrangling probably won't start until after Pesach. And then you have 45 days for somebody to try to get the government. If he can't do it, the other guy gets 30 more days and another 15 days. This thing could schlep on well into the fall and even into the winter, which is interesting because in the meantime, you have a caretaker government. But according to the caretaker government we have right now, Netanyahu is the prime minister until November. November, that prime ministership goes over via the rotation agreement to Benny Gantz, right? If we go to November and there's no coalition, you could have a situation where Gantz becomes the caretaker prime minister. And that is going to be especially interesting if he doesn't get into the Knesset, because there is a chance that the blue and white party won't pass the 3.25% threshold needed to get into the Knesset. And then you have a question, can somebody who's not a Knesset member be the prime minister? Let's hope we don't go there, and that question remains theoretical.
Herb, that is a great way to end this session. Jenny, take us out.
All right, so I want to thank everyone for being here today with us. It was lovely being able to bridge the ocean with this conversation and learn a bit more about your perspective on the ground. I wanted to make sure everyone knew about a new resource for programming like this. I popped the link in the chat, but you can also find it by going to our homepage. The new community calendar, which I'm gonna risk a technical faux pas and see if I can actually bring it up. It is pretty beautiful, and if you want to, you can plug in a keyword. So there are experience types, and you can hit Israel, and then that'll show you everything that's coming up. You can hit this agenda button, and it shows you everything listed that has Israel as an experience type. So I just wanted to let you know that that is there for you as a resource to find more opportunities for learning. And we're so glad that you spent an hour of your time with us today. So
Thank you, Jenny.
have a great week.
Herb, thank you. Liz, thank you. Have a happy Pesach.
Pleasure.
Have a happy Pesach, and hopefully your families will be together.
Chag
Amen.
Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.